Bapak dan Ibu peserta workshop Good Standardisation Practice hari kedua. Terima kasih untuk hadir di sesi ini. Ini merupakan hari kedua ya, sesi terakhir Bapak Ibu. Setelah ini akan ada paparan dari Mr. Carsten Kudal. Apabila Bapak Ibu nanti ada pertanyaan selama paparan, dipersilahkan untuk mengetik di chat room sesuai dengan format seperti kemarin. Jadi ada nama, institusi, dan pertanyaannya. Nanti akan dibahas oleh Mr. Carsten. Selain itu, Bapak Ibu juga nanti dipersilahkan mengisi daftar hadir dan survei yang akan disampaikan linknya pada akhir acara. Baik, kami persilakan kepada Mr. Carsten Kudal untuk memulai paparannya. Please, Carsten. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess you can hear me. I have already communicated a bit, so this part should be fine. Now let's go to the more technical parts. I shall find my slide. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess you have all been here yesterday, but still I'll just shortly present what is the program for today and also shortly tell you what, or make a little brush up on what we discussed or I presented yesterday. I managed to, because I should move a presentation from yesterday to today, I managed to mix it up a bit. So actually we start with standardization deliverables, the last item on this agenda here with international standards, technical specifications, and so on. It should be moved up as the first one. The idea with this is to go a little deeper in also the alternatives to international standards, which of course is the most prominent deliverable from standardization work. But you should also be familiar with the other ones and what they are and what status they have in the system. After that, we have given allocated time to discuss private standards, also UN standards, Codex, and the UN ECE standards, but primarily we will focus on private standards so that you get a better understanding of what it is, because it is a concept which has come in from the last 20 years and is playing a much bigger role among private enterprises when they trade and so on. So therefore, I'll try to explain you a bit about it and what it is. And then we go to something which is on the edge of what is good standardization practice, namely how to use standards for regulation. There are some WTO, World Trade Organization, recommendations with regard to how standards can be used in connection with technical regulation. I will tell you a little about this, but I will also look at how standards are used in practice in connection with technical regulation. So this is the program for today. The timing of the different presentations may not be 100% correct now. We may also end a little earlier. This program, even though there are a lot of words here, it's not so comprehensive as it was yesterday. So perhaps we can do it in 2 hours or 2.5 hours. We will see. It also depends on whether you have questions. Yesterday, we focused on what we can say is the core of good standardization practice, namely the process, all the procedures, or how the process is when you develop standards from the preliminary phase to the proposal phase, to the committee phase, to the approval phase, and back to review and withdrawal. We also looked at the roles of the different players in the standardization work, in the national standards body, the chairman, the secretariat, the committee itself, and so on and so on. Today we go, as I say, to something a bit more around it, or so therefore to say that this is good standardization practice is perhaps a kind of exaggeration or a very wide interpretation of it. But I think it's still something which is really important to you to know about, and therefore I've been looking forward to make this presentation. When you look at the ISO system, there are different kind of deliverables. There are ISO standards, as we know well. When I say ISO standards, I automatically also include IEC standards, because IEC standards are made by another organization, but when you look at ISO and IEC, they are very much merged when it comes to their the rules for the development of standards and how things are working. You will see some differences in how they name their documents. IEC, they have not changed it to the ISO, where you have committee draft and draft international standard. They have other names of the same documents. So it's not just something you shall be aware of if you work in the electrotechnical world. Then we have the technical specifications. I'll tell you a bit about that. Technical reports, public available specifications, not something you perhaps see so often, but it's good to know what it is. We also have international workshop agreements and the guides. But let's start with the ISO standards, which is, as I said, the most prominent deliverable from the standardization world. Standards provides rules, guidelines, characteristics for activities or their results. They are aimed at achieving the optimum degree of order in the given context. It's important always to remember that standards are not necessarily state of the art. It's the best compromise you can find among the stakeholders involved in the standardization work. So it's an optimum degree of order in a given context. There are always different interests when you start developing a standard, and this is somehow reflected in the standard. As I gave you an example yesterday from long time ago, when it was considered whether there should be an international standard for occupational health and safety, where the industry, they had in Denmark for sure one position on this, while the labor unions, they had another one. This is this kind of conflicts or disagreements about how things shall be, it is somehow reflected in the standards. Apart from product standards, which are probably the ones which are given most attention, or there are also a lot of other examples, and including test methods and codes of practice, terminology standards, guideline standards, and management system standards, which have become much more important. And when you look at how standards or which standards are sold from the different standardization bodies, then you will see that it's very typical that we have this 20-80 distribution of standards. There are 20% of the standards which represent 80% of the sale. The 80% of the standards, they don't sell much. It's more a niche, it's small technical areas which have a smaller audience. But for management standards, there is a big audience, and it's something which has been given a lot of attention and high ranking when it comes to sale since the late 80s. Standards are normally not meant to be used for certification. Another thing we'll come back to is that standards are not meant to be used for legislation either. They are simply not formulated. There are some rules about how to formulate standards, and they are not formulated so that they are good for certification. There are, of course, exceptions such as the management standards, which are closely linked to the certification world. but standards in general are not meant to be used for certification. What are the characteristics of the standards? First of all, they're demand-driven. As we talked about yesterday, if there's no demand for a standard, then there's probably no funding, and then there is no standard. But if there is a demand, if there is funding, then it's also possible to start a standardization project. They are developed by a wide range of interested parties, but they are dominated by the strong players. I gave you the example yesterday from the lift world or from the lift industry. It's clear when you go into, if you attend a meeting on international level in such a business, which is very international, then you will see that it is the big players who are extremely experienced in standardization. They use it almost as a kind of a political forum where they discuss different approaches and try to push through the way or the technical solutions they prefer. I was in Denmark. We have a lot of pharmaceutical companies, and one of them is a well-known one in the diabetes area, which is called Novo or Novo Nordic. And Novo Nordic, they had many years ago a long dispute or discussions in the committee about how these small injectors of insulin should look like, or what kind of safety issues should be addressed in the standard. And it's the other big player in this was Eli Lilly, I think it's called, an American producer of diabetes. And it is a long and discussion, and they ended up with a solution Novo Nordic wanted to have, and then Eli Lilly, they had to go back and change the development work they had on this device so that they could comply with the standard when it was published. So it is dominated by the big players, and especially when it comes to these very international areas like pharmaceuticals, like electrical products, where you don't produce only to your country or to your region, you produce for the world because the development costs are so big. They are, as we discussed yesterday, developed in accordance with an agreed set of rules, where it can be an easy standard to develop. Then they typically choose to develop it over a 2-year period, perhaps even faster. Or it can be a difficult one, which requires 4 years development time. It is consensus-based. It's achieving technical order, as I said, but it's not a regulatory instrument. We'll come back to the risks you take if you use standards directly in your legislation. They're reviewed every 5 years or earlier. It's a committee which publishes a standard which decide when a standard shall be reviewed, but they shall every 5 years carry out a review. They are not overlapping with other standards. One of the key principles is coherency. They're voluntary, and they are standards, the most prominent deliverable of a standardization body. But there are others. There are other kind of deliverables. A technical specification is another kind of deliverable, and it addresses work which is still under technical development, or where it is believed that there will be a standard in the future, but not immediately. This is typically used in technical fields where the technological development is very fast. For example, if you work with the more digital world, sometimes the development of standards can take a lot of time, but in the middle of this process, you may have a document which is quite good, but there are some details people cannot agree on. But they want it to be shared with the world, with the public, And therefore, the committee can decide to publish this not standard, but this document, this working paper, as a technical specification. You should remember that when you start making a proposal for a new standard, then the first thing you do is to make a draft. Sometimes we have a draft delivered from the one who make the proposal for a new standard, but this draft is following the rules for how to the template for a standard 100%. So during the standardization process, you're actually working with a standard. But as I said, if you cannot agree on it and you feel that this is something which should be shared with the public, then you can publish it as a technical specification. So it is published for immediate use, but it also provides a mean to obtain feedback, because when the public, they see this document, they may have some concerns. They say, we should focus on this, more on this, or these requirements are too strict, or these requirements are too weak. These things this is a way also to get some feedback from the market. The idea is eventually that the technical specification is published as an international standard. Therefore, the technical specification also has a limited lifetime. A limited lifetime, which is first, it is published for a 3-year period, and it can be extended for another 3-year period. But then it has to either to be converted into a standard, or it has to be withdrawn. So 6 years is as old as a technical specification can be. So it follows, since it is taken out from the classic standardization work, it follows typically the process of the development of a standard, and it is either a failed standard because we cannot agree, or it is because the technical committee is kind of impatient and want to publish something as quick as possible because they feel that there is a demand on the market for some guidance in a certain area. When you look at the technical specification, since it is started as a classic standardization work, it is demand-driven. It is also developed as a wide range of interested parties who could not agree on publishing it as a standard. It is developed in accordance with exactly the same rules as for standards, consensus-based, reviewed after 3 years or earlier if they decide so in the committee, and it can, as a maximum, have a lifetime of 6 years. It is not overlapping with other standards because it has been through all the process from the very beginning, where you ensure that there are not other standards which has the same scope or overlapping scope with the standard. But the standard is not a real standard. And it's also a bit risky to use it for more than kind of a guidance paper. If you start to make references to a technical specification in legislation, for example, then it will be complicated after years when it is withdrawn. There are different examples. For example, in the conformity assessment area, you'll find this ISO IEC standard in the famous 17,000 series, where they in 2018 published a document about requirements for bodies providing audit and certification of management systems, part 10. Competence requirements for auditing and certification of occupational health and safety management systems. This is something where there are probably sitting a lot of people around the table discussing how this should be done. And especially auditing, I know that from my past, auditing of occupational health and safety systems is very complicated because there are a lot of elements in this, because you have firstly to take into consideration the legislation, and it's different from country to country. And then you have all these mandatory or basic requirements in the standard. It doesn't help that you totally comply with the requirements if you don't comply also with the legislation. It's a complicated area. So, but at the same time, they have probably felt in this committee that there was a need to share what they have achieved until this time in 2018, and therefore they published the document as a technical specification. This document, it intends to guarantee a harmonized approach to the accreditation of, in accordance with ISO 45001, and ensure those auditing and then standard are up to scratch. This was what I found about it. But we also have other deliverables. Standards, we have technical specifications, then we have technical reports. A technical report is not developed in accordance with the standardization process. It means that there has not been a proposal, there's not been a preliminary phase or a committee phase. A technical report contains information of different kind from that of the previous two publications. Meaning specification and standard. The technical report is typically something which can be more academic. We had in Denmark a company which was specialized into not chimneys, but the outcast from chimneys, and how to measure how the environmental consequences of outcast from a chimney, and it was at that time at least one of the leading companies in this field. And when a standard should be developed, they developed a report which described in details all these different kinds of calculations you carry out when you should find out whether the outcast is acceptable, or the limits for whatever there may be in such a thing, in such smoke, were acceptable. It was a report, but it was so good a report that they decided in the committee to publish it as a technical report. So, and in other, it can also, as this example here, it may include the data from a survey. It's an example. It's simply just an informative report which somehow supports the standard which is under development. So these choices, decisions taken during the standardization process, maybe they are difficult to understand for the users, but then they can buy the technical report and say, okay, this is the reason why they have done this, because the way we usually have done it is perhaps not the the best possible way. So a technical report is a document which supports the choices or the decisions taken during the standardization process. The characteristics of a technical report, it is that it is developed in connection with the standardization work, typically developed by highly specialized experts, not necessarily the experts in the committee. In my case here, it was a company which provided this. They had an expert in the committee, but it was a company, the Danish company, which provided the report for the committee. There are no rules for the format. It can be a narrative text, it can be very technical text, but there are no rules. You should not follow the template for standards when you write such a document. It's informative. There is no limitation of the lifetime. Typically, if it's some basic research in a specific area, then it doesn't change so much over time. These things are natural science based, perhaps, and then you don't have to consider whether there is a need for a review after 3 or 5 years. So it can stay there until the committee thinks that this is not necessary any longer. Perhaps the requirements in the standards are fully accepted. They don't have questions to why they have done it like it is, and therefore they can withdraw it. It covers a specific topic. There are no requirements in it. It is informative, and it is basically about sharing knowledge or experience. This is an example of an ISO technical report, basic considerations for the safety of hydrogen systems, guidelines for the use of hydrogen in its gaseous and liquid forms, as well as its storage in either of these or other forms, hybrids. So it's very technical, as you can see, but it is, as I said, more academic paper supporting the standardization work. The fourth deliverable we had 6 in total, I think it was. It's the public available specification, which is published to respond to an urgent market need. It's representing either the consensus of the experts within a working group or the consensus in an organization outside ISO. As it is with technical specification, public available specifications are published for immediate use and also to serve as a means to obtain feedback for eventual transformation into an international standard. So you can say it's a more, it's kind of not a public inquiry, but it is in a way to send out something to the market which they can consider, is this useful? And then they get feedback and decide whether they want to take into account the feedback, of course, or whether it is something, if there are some need for transforming this public available specification into a standard. It has a maximum life of 6 years, after which it can be transformed into a standard or it has to be withdrawn. There is an example here about petroleum products, considerations for fuel suppliers and users regarding marine fuel quality in view of implementation of maximum 0.5% of sulfur in 2020. There were some goals with regard to sulfur in chemical in marine fuel, and it should be achieved within a timeline which was 2020, and therefore they made this quickly so that the industry could be informed about how to achieve these goals. Perhaps this is the last one. I think, no, we have guides also. So, but this is the 5th one. International workshop agreements. It's another kind of document which is developed. We have something similar in the European system. I think actually workshop agreements was invented in the European standardization system, and then it has been taken, also brought up to international level. It's a document which is developed outside the normal ISO committee system, and typically it is administered by one of the member bodies. It means one of the national standardization bodies. The way it is done typically, we had one in Denmark where there was a need for some kind of document describing call centers work. When you have problems with your computer, then you don't necessarily call a call center at Microsoft in Denmark, you may call a call center in Microsoft in India. And there was a need for such some kind of description of how it should work and what you can expect from it. What are the critical issues when it comes to parameters, when it comes to the quality of a call center. It is how quick they answer phones and so on and so on. So therefore it was decided in Denmark to make, it was a European workshop agreement, but the process is the same. They came to Danish Standards, asked us to set up or to appoint a secretary who could manage the administrative work around the development of such a workshop agreement. So the secretary at Danish Standards invited the stakeholders, presented the process. There was already a working document prepared by the organization which had this need for a workshop agreement. And this was a basis for the discussions at some meetings. It was not many meetings, 3 or 4 meetings in total. And then they had a workshop agreement. It's basically the same you do with international workshop agreements. And it's later on, there may be a standard in the area, but this is a way where a certain industry, for example, can decide to develop a document which can be kind of a reference for them when they have make contracts or they trade in between themselves. So it's not something which is used widely, but it's a way where an industry decides to use the competences of the standardization body in their development of common documents. It's also in the documents, it's indicated who have developed the documents. So it's not as it is for standards where you know that there is a wide range of stakeholders, but you don't know who it is. It's different when it comes to international workshop agreements and also European workshop agreements. Here you can see that it has been this and this company and this institution and this research institution, if such ones have been invited, they have developed it. So especially if it's a document developed only by the industry, then people who get it into their hand, they know that it is probably focusing primarily on their needs and not so many other needs. So the balance you will find in a standard is not necessary in an international workshop agreement. Finally, the last deliverable I will come around is the guides. The guides are, as it's written here, are just that, they are guides. There are a lot of different ones. I can't remember exactly the number, but it's I think it's more than 30 we have in ISO. Some of them are more important than others, but basically they help the readers understand more about main areas where standards add value. But they can also have very precise rules about how to develop standards. One of the most important ISO guides is ISO Guide 21, which tells organizations like BSN how to adopt standards correctly. And it also tells or explains, if you want to modify a standard, what are the consequences with regard to numbering? How do you make it clear in the standard that here you have made some changes? It can be done in the foreword, it can be done in the text. There are different alternatives, but all this is described in ISO Guide 21. So this is one of the important ones. There is also an ISO Guide 22, I think it is, or is it 52? It's perhaps 52, sorry, about Code of Good Practice for Development of Standards. Code of Good Practice for Development of Standards is actually an annex to the World Trade Organization's TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. It's an Annex 3 to this agreement, which describes how standards, international standards, should be developed. And it's adopted, you can say, through this guide, it has been adopted by ISO as this is how it should be done. It focuses on the same things as we talked about yesterday, such as the values or principles for standardization and so on. It also has more technical areas, like how to deal with patents. Sometimes it's we only know one word for, there's a specific kind of screws which are called, in Denmark at least, I think it's international umbraco, which is has a certain shape, and you just put, but umbraco is actually a patent. So you can't use the word umbraco in a standard, because then you are in conflict with the patent, but you can describe it. So this guide gives you some advice on how to manage patents which are mentioned directly or indirectly in the standard. And then you should be aware that there is a full list of ISO guides it is published on the website of ISO, so it's easy to find. And I'm sure that the secretaries at the BSN or the other line ministries who are responsible for different technical committees, that they are aware of this and know how to use these guides. I don't know if there are any questions here. This was what we planned to do already yesterday, but I don't have so much more. I have more for sure, but I think we are still on time. So if there are any questions, they're welcome.
Hi, Karsten. In the chat, there's 2 questions.
Yeah.
From Bapak Suharman Nurman. Kalau mungkin Bapak bisa menyampaikan langsung pertanyaannya, Pak. Kami persilakan.
Baik.
Oh.
Thank you, Carlson. I'm Norman from Indonesia. Work for TC323 with now in circular economy. I have some questions because I have been experiencing in developing standard with BSN Indonesia prior in ISO 26000 social responsibility for almost 3 years. Something that I have a question, what exactly basic reason atau background when some countries in Europe special in developing the standard? I mean the mainstreaming issues in my understanding mostly concern on sustainability or sustainable development issues like SDGs, something like that. And secondly, how we consider the stakeholder matters in developing the standard. I have a debate with some friend from European during the discussion on developing the standard. I also how the standard will be more simple, that more ordinary people can understand that standard. You know, the languages of standard is very high, like most master PhD people can well understood on this. That's my question only. Thank you for your good presentation today, and also yesterday. I also joined yesterday. Thank you, Carson.
You're welcome. Yeah, I mean, you actually point out an interesting area of problem which I also addressed a bit earlier. Namely that there is this very academic approach in Europe, and perhaps a more hands-on how do we do approach in other parts of the world. We also with Europe as, let's say, the most developed or the most rich countries. So therefore Denmark was actually very active in its corporate social responsibility. It's social responsibility now, isn't it? Yeah, they were very active in the beginning, but it's an area which has developed a lot. So that in the very beginning it was more practical, but it has become very idealistic. But they also I don't know whether it is what are the besides, they focus very much on sustainability. This is what's about. But I don't know exactly what is the alternative. I mean, it's an interesting discussion. So I don't know. Let me hear, what is your approach? What would you prefer it to be? I mean, it's actually an interesting part of the problem or the question. Where it goes wrong?
Yeah, my understanding is mostly the issue is ESG, economic, environmental, social governance. The scope mostly is around that, the development standard. That's my point. Is it correct or not? Because we want to care the planet. We want to care each stakeholder, economic and business development. They have to care. There's three pillar issues: social, economic, and environment. So I learned by many teams in Indonesia that the mainstreaming mostly in ESG and economic, environment, social governance. That's the mostly standard working area. That's my question. Is this correct or not? This is my opinion. Thank you.
I think I don't think I can answer this question. It's very specific, but I would love to investigate a bit. After this, I hope that Mita, she will share my email address with everybody, and then you can write me it as a question, and then I can actually go a bit deeper in it, because as I said, Denmark is one of these countries where they actually the whole idea about developing at that time it was called corporate social responsibility. And a bit more focused, perhaps, because it was more, now social responsibility is more wide. So therefore, it has probably also changed the way they approached it. But this is something I can find out. But you will get my email address from Mita. Hopefully she hear me. And then
okay.
And then you can send it as
Carsten.
Then I will investigate.
Thank you.
Okay. Mita, do we have more questions?
Only one question from Mr. Agus Priyono. Ada Bapak Agus Priyono?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm sorry that I can on my video because there is a question of internet in my home. I want to have you help me to elaborate the meaning of demand driven on proposal standardization. Could the standard proposal driven by producer demand, or should be driven by consumer driven?
This is a question. I mean, in the ideal world, it would be great if the consumers came up with proposals for new standards. In the real world, they are not so active. They're very critical to certain areas where people, especially children, as I mentioned yesterday, where they are injured and something like that. But most standards are, the demand comes actually from the inner circle in the standardization world. If you look at when you start developing a new area of standards, many years ago, one of my colleagues started up developing standards for welding in Europe. It was just a few standards about welding, but then you find out that there are so many different kinds of metals, different kind of methods, and you needed a standard for each of them, because you can't just use this one for aluminium on iron or another kind of steel. So it was the committee itself, and therefore probably the users of welding material, these were the ones who actually had the demand for more standards. So today there's a lot of welding standards for each different method you use. So I cannot put a percentage on how many standards are demanded from industry and how many are from consumers, but I don't think consumers in their daily life meet standards or think about standards. When they take a piece of paper, oh, you can almost see it, they don't think that this is based on a standard, but of course it is. Otherwise it would not fit into the printer. So the demand from the consumers is limited. You can also say that many of these demands are represented, or the consumer's demand is represented by the public authorities. The public authorities are there to take care of all of us, of the citizens in the countries. And if they see that there is a need, because we have a lot of accidents, for example, in a certain area, there is a need for some safety standards in this area, they will express it. Not the consumer, not the one who was injured. He will not say, this shall be solved by developing a standard for this. It's so yeah, consumers is something we always mention them, and we always say that they're extremely important in standardization, but in practice, they are not there very much. And they are primarily in areas which are important to, for children and so on, as I said, all these things which are related to safety for children. So demand-driven is primarily from the industry in a certain area. If you talk about management standards, it may be from the industry, which is certification bodies and so on. They have a need for a standard or for revision of a standard or whatever. This is where you see the main demand. Still demand-driven, and I'm quite impressed about how standards actually cover so widely, so that we don't feel that we are in danger all the time. If we think about it, we don't. When I was a child and I used when I had hair on my head, believe it or not, I was a child, used a hairdryer, and the TV, it was disturbed by this hairdryer. Then it was probably not safe either, but it is today because of standards. So demand-driven, it comes from industry, but they also have an interest. They don't have an interest in unsafe products either. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Karsten, we have 2 questions in the
Okay.
chat room. Do you want to proceed now or later in the?
We can have them now.
Okay. May I ask Pak Edi Wiloso to ask the question directly? Pak Edi Wiloso, silakan.
Ya, terima kasih. Thank you, Karsten. I have 2 questions. You explained that standards are typically developed and used on voluntary basis. But there might be a case that a country adopt the standard, which is voluntary, but use it and regulate it as mandatory. Would there be any problem on that, such kind of practice? The second one, yesterday you said that halal certification is a technical or trade barrier. Could you explain more on that? Thank you.
Yes, I'm glad. This is a good question, and it's something we go much deeper into later on. It's funny because we have this World Trade Organization's TBT agreement, which says that we shall align technical legislation with standards, with international standards. It means that a country shall not go in one direction with their technical regulation, while the rest of the world, they agree that the best solutions on this is described in an international standard. But then it is understood quite often as if we just make these standards mandatory, then we actually comply with the requirements in the WTO TBT agreement. But the problem is, as you will hear later on, so I will not go deep into this, there are a lot of consequences when you do this. Firstly, referring to yesterday, if you just refer to the lift standard with 12 requirements and 8 of them are related to safety, something which is important for the country, for the member, for the society, and therefore also for the government. But the last 4 are actually negotiated in by the big players in the lift world. Then you should be really careful when you make a reference to such a standard, because you exclude all the cheaper, but still good, but cheaper, for example, Chinese producers of lifts. It's difficult to read when you read a standard whether this is a kind of a luxury requirement from Kone or from another big player in the market, or it is something related to safety. In Europe, we have harmonized standards, and harmonized standards support implementation of legislation. In these harmonized standards, there is an annex, Set A, it's called in SEN standards. In this Set A, they take the 8 safety-related requirements, say, these ones you shall comply with to get a CE mark on your product. The last 4, we don't care. But there is, so if you start referring to standards, you should really know about a lot about the standards. This is where you, as an expert in standardization, should advise before the government, they use the standards you know something about. You should advise them and say, be careful here. Another thing, and we'll come back to this, is the numbering and the dating. If you refer to a standard without a date, then every time the standard is revised, it's automatically the new one which is valid. And the question is whether this is of interest to the government, because then in practice you move some of the legislatory power from the government, from the parliamentary system to the standardization system. It's risky. Then you can freeze it and say, we use the version from 2013, but then you are freezed in an old technology. So it's another thing which can be, so there are a lot of issues, but we'll come back to this. So making them mandatory, it makes sense sometimes. For example, I said in construction area, for how to calculate statics and so on, makes good sense. In many other areas, it's not a good idea. The other question you had was about technical barriers to trade, how certification could be a technical barrier to trade, or was it? Yeah. Certification has historically been a really efficient way of making it difficult for foreign companies to get into a market. We have lots of good examples from Europe before we got the single market back in the 90s. For example, if you wanted to have some hi-fi equipment, record players, whatever, if you wanted to export it to France, then you should have a certification. And this certification could only be obtained in a specific laboratory, in a specific area in the mountains. And there was always a long waiting list. So before you actually could place your product on the market, which was in an area which was developing quite quickly, the product was outdated. So it was a way to make it difficult for foreigners to get into the market. It can be done much more elegant or much more advanced than this way. But for example, forcing, not accepting test reports from other countries, this is a way to use certification or conformity assessment procedures to make it difficult for foreign companies to get into a market. So yeah, it is very common. Okay.
So specifically on halal certification, is it
halal? Oh,
yes.
Halal certification is very complicated area, which I do not know enough about. But I know from my time in Palestine, where they paid a lot of attention to this, that that there are different schools, or whatever you can call them, when it comes to halal. So they said they wanted to base it on Malaysia. But I have talked to people, and I can't remember who, but somebody in Indonesia, and they said, but what about Malaysia? They're really good in this. No, we don't want it. So it seems that every single country have a little another way of thinking halal, even though you all believe, I mean, I also believe that when you buy something which is halal certified in Malaysia, then you can clearly eat it without any problems. But it seems to be an area which is extremely difficult to harmonize internationally. And then you can explain me, but it's more religious related than, and this is not, but it's so again, but every time you have different schemes, certification schemes for the same, basically the same purpose, then it can easily make technical barriers to trade. So this was actually a good example by you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Last question from
Last question, thank
Ibu
you.
Widayati Sutrisno. Silakan Ibu Widayati.
Hello, Karsten.
Hello.
Thank you to Mbak Mita who already gave me the opportunity to ask. Yesterday, I asked about the wooden furniture, but now I ask about something else. Today, Indonesia have already have products that has not allowed anymore to be exported. And we are in a village or a small industrial companies have already used copper and brass. Brass consists of copper and zinc as usual. So I would like to ask you if there is any international workshop agreements which consist of talking or discussion about this. Is there any rules of international workshop agreements for this? Thank you.
It's so specific that you probably already know my answer. I don't know. But what you should do, and this is important to know, that all WTO members, including Indonesia, they have a WTO inquiry point. The WTO inquiry point is, I think, located at BSN. I'm not 100% sure. It can also be in parts of Ministry of Trade, but I think it is at BSN because it's typically where you're located. You can send this question here to the WTO inquiry point, and then they will help you. They have access to all the scopes of different kind of standards deliverables, from standards, classic standards, to workshop agreements or whatever. So they should be able to help you. It's too technical, and it's also a very narrow area for me to answer questions of. But my advice is to contact WTO inquiry point at BSN. Mita must correct me if it's not located there, but it's typically at the National Standards Body that you find this. If you have questions to the requirements on export markets, then you can also send it to the WTO inquiry point. Then they forward your question to the inquiry point in the country you want to export to. And then they will, for example, we want to export to Portugal, then the Portuguese WTO inquiry point will investigate what are the rules here, technical regulation standards, if there are national standards, of course not international standards, but pure national standards. Then they will investigate, send back the reply to WTO inquiry point at BSN, and then BSN will send it to you. It's a great system. If it works, it's a great system. So I hope you can get some help there. Thanks.
Okay, but I think that international workshop agreements will be needed because the change of the law or something from Department of Trade in Indonesia, some rules, I think like that. Do you agree?
Yeah, as I said, it's very difficult for me to answer it because
it's okay. Okay, thank you.
But thank you for the question. Shall we continue, Mita?
Yeah, no more questions left. Please go ahead.
Okay. Now we will look at other kind of standards. And it means that if we talk about good standardization practice, we are out of good standardization practice. Now it's common knowledge for people involved in standardization that you shall know what is this. And I will shortly present two of the more important ones. I have been involved a couple of times recently in the Gulf in projects where we should find out how they implement international standards and so on. And there it's of course also, especially in these Gulf countries, very important with the regulation of motor vehicles. And for motor vehicles, there are a set of standards which is internationally recognized as the basis for approval of motor vehicles. It's the World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations, which is a working party under the UNECE, and it is responsible for managing 3 different agreements. The first one from 1958 is a basic one and the important one. The 2 other ones are more kind of amendments to the first agreement. But the idea in this cooperation is that it is waste of resources that all countries, when a new car, for example, is produced, that they shall go through the whole process of approving it, approving the brakes and the steering and the windscreen or whatever. So therefore, they have developed a set of standards, but this is what you focus on when you have when you want to place have a car approved. Then there are some signatory members of these agreements. The signatory members acknowledge approval by other signatory members. So for example, if Germany, which is a signatory member, if they have approved a car, like my own Volkswagen, then we automatically acknowledge this approval in Denmark. It's not all countries which are members of UNECE VP or signatory member of Working Party 29. I think that Indonesia is, but I'm not 100% sure. They can still base, and they do, very much the approval of cars on this. But this is the idea with these standards, which are very important. When you look at trade figures, export-import of cars is a big one. It's a big deal. It's a lot of money. Then we have Codex Alimentarius, also a UN organization like UNECE. Codex is a collection of international recognized standards, codes, practices, guidelines, and other recommendations published by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and it's related to food, food production, food labeling, and food safety. Let me see. Yeah. Okay, I should in a way firstly finalize UNECE, but sorry, I'll go to Codex immediately. Codex Alimentarius is an area which is really important, and then you can ask yourself, do they develop standards? They are developing standards, but it's more recommendations on how to deal with food safety issues. What is acceptable when you look at pesticides, which is, there's non-acceptance with pesticides on fruit, but what is acceptable with regard to limits for different kind of contaminants on different kind of food products. They give some recommendations which are the international recommendations. Then typically the countries, they refer to these Codex standards when they develop food safety regulation. But they can also decide that this is not strict enough. We want to tighten it a bit more. So we don't set the limit here, we set it a bit lower. This is something they can do, and it is not in conflict with anything. It's a right to have as a country. But standards, Codex standards, are in general used as they are around the world. Codex is developed by experts. It's not, you don't have industry sitting there and say, oh, we shall have a higher limit on this so that we allow more pesticides, I cannot say, but other kind of spraying of agriculture products. They are not sitting there. This is a very scientific world where they, first of all, and perhaps not only, look at food safety based on scientific figures and investigations. So the approved standards take many forms, but they are regulations on levels of food additives or limits for pesticide residues, guidelines on nutrition labeling. The way a label on a product looks today, it is not the national authorities which decide that it shall be described this way per 100 gram or per percentage of daily, what you need of per day of something. This is a format or a template developed under the Codex system. Here is an example of a standard for honey, adopted in 1981 and revised again in 1987 and amended in 2019. There are some definitions in this: the moisture content, the sugar content, the water content, food additives, contaminants. These things are described. There are some limits there with regard to how honey should be if it should be used for consumption. So just to sum up, Codex is not an open organization as you see it for ISO, for example, where you can be nominated to be a member of a mirror committee and perhaps be a member of an international working group or technical committee. This is not how it works with the Codex area. Codex area is closely related to the public authorities. Sometimes it is administered by the standardization body. But for example, in Denmark, where I came from, we tried to say, but the Codex, when I worked at Danish Standards, Codex it's also a standard. Shouldn't we administrate this as well? But the food safety authorities, they said strictly, absolutely no, absolutely no. This has nothing, we shall not have big dairy companies and so on sitting next to us when we shall negotiate some water content in yogurt or whatever it must be. They wanted to decide it themselves. They wanted to be a strict public authority responsibility. So Codex is not a common standard, and for sure the development of Codex standards is very different from what you know from the ISO world. I go back to UNEC, to the motor vehicles. It's a legal framework, as I said, for the contracting. It's not signatory. Contracting parties under the different agreements from 1958 and 97 and 98, where you have a common set of technical prescriptions and protocols for type approval of vehicles. Most countries, even if they are not member of this, they recognize the UN regulation as the basis for the approval of cars. As I said, I recently worked in the Gulf. They are not member, of UNECE, but they use all the standards. But then on the top of that, they have their own approval system in the GSO, which is a regional standardization body in the Gulf. So they keep the jurisdiction there. They don't, by default, accept that a car is approved in another country. But basically they do for 99% of the cases they do, but then they have some specific areas, especially because they have extreme heat there. And then there are some requirements, for example, to windscreens. But this is a very special case. But UNECE is used worldwide for approval of cars. Otherwise, it would be very time consuming for different countries to get new cars on the market. When you have a specific area, car part, a spare part, or then it may need an approval. And there are some types of approval, which you, for example, see on tires. They are marked with E. It means that they live up to these requirements you have in your UNECE standard. As I said, some countries have their own national standards for granting type approvals, for example, in the Gulf. And it may be more stringent simply because they think that they are not stringent enough in UNECE, but it can also be because of some specific conditions in the country. As I said, extreme heat in the Gulf may sometimes be a challenge to the windscreen, which breaks easily if it gets extremely hot. Here we have examples from the UNECE world. There are a lot of tires, approval systems or approval standards, tires for passenger cars, tires for commercial vehicles and their trailers, etc., etc. We don't have to go through them. But what is interesting is that at the same time, there are also standards developed under ISO. These may have another scope, so that they are not in conflict with the UNECE standards. But here you can see that there are some standards for passenger car tires and rims developed under ISO. So it's not all you find in ISO, in UNECE. You can also find spare part standards or standards for specific areas in ISO. These are the two UNECE standards for cars, Codex for food. These are the two kind of standards which are quite often discussed when we talk about the standards, and they say, it's not exactly the same kind of standards as an ISO standard. Another kind of standards which have become more and more important, or at least have got more and more attention, is private standards. Private standards, they are produced by non-governmental bodies and entities addressing concerns related to typically food safety, environmental protection, animal welfare, fair trade, labor conditions, and human rights issues. When you look at the different kind of regulation or standards we have, then if we should try to put in and place the private standards in the system, then if we could almost say it's a kind of a hierarchy. And the top of the hierarchy, also when you want to export, it's a technical regulation. If you want to export to Europe, you look at the technical regulation, and then perhaps you can find some standards which can help you comply with the technical regulation. But the technical regulation is the basis. It's the highest, it's the top of the hierarchy. Then you have international standards or regional standards. They are voluntary. you can be sure that they are coherent, that they are, you don't have, if you choose a standard, then you can be sure that there is not a kind of a conflicting standard if it has been adopted, if the international standard has been adopted. It covers systems and products and so on, and it's a kind of a puzzle where all the different standards, they represent a piece of this puzzle. And they are developed by international recognized standard bodies. This international recognition is done by ISO, not by WTO. WTO, they have a definition of what is an international standards body. ISO and IEC are for sure international standard bodies. ITU, international standard body. And then there are others which are a bit in the gray zone, like ASTM, which is, they have standards which are internationally recognized, but it is still an American standardization body. API for petroleum products, the only one they use in the oil sector, but still not seen, as far as I know, as an international one. So it is a bit difficult to be recognized as an international one. Then we have the private standards. Here, standards are overlapping each other. There's no coherency here. They are not developed in an open and transparent and consensus-based environment, as you know from standards, from international standards, as we learned yesterday. They are specific, they are very targeted on specific areas. For example, social issues. Coffee producers are typically underpaid compared to what we pay when we buy some Lavazza or coffee in the shop. Then we can be sure that Lavazza, they earn a lot of money, perhaps also the collectors, they earn a lot of money, but the coffee producers, they don't earn as much as they should. So therefore, there are some private standards which try to ensure that a certain part of this profit in the value chain is allocated to the farmers. It can also be environmental issues. We'll come back to that a bit later with some examples. Food safety. Somebody perhaps know this BRC, which is earlier it was called British Retail Consortium, I think it was. Now it has changed a bit, but still the same abbreviation. But anyway, food safety is something where there's developed a certification scheme or a standard which is focusing on the specific needs of the retail, part of the value chain, their needs. Wood legality, I know from my work in Indonesia that you have SVLK, certification of wood-based products, but there is also internationally the FSC certification. Private standards play a role because suddenly they have started to include them as a reference, as a requirement when you enter into agreements or contracts with international companies. So if you want to export, for example, some food products to a British mall or a chain of malls, so it can be quite big, then suddenly there may be a requirement for a BRC, British Retail Consortium certification. So it has absolutely nothing to do with the government. It has nothing to do with, if it was a British mall, it has nothing to do with a requirement from the British government that there should be a BRC certification on the products placed in the freezers. And then it's worth also mentioning that it is developed by specialists or in very closed forums. So this openness you see from standardization where you can influence things and try to change it if you disagree. It is not possible. There are some openings here and there where they invite specialists from the industry to participate in work, but it's more invitation to whom they want to see. It's not open as you know it from ISO or from the national standardization work. I have this old slide here, which describes all the different kind of standards, organizations, and as you can see, we have ISO in the upper left corner, ISO and IEC. We have the UN Organization Codex, ITU, ECE, but then we have all these private ones, and this is just a few ones I have listed up here. There are much more, especially if you go down into a national level. These here are more the international ones. I'll give you some examples of private standards, which are quite often actually more like private certification schemes. I'm not critical to this at all, but we should not be blind that this is also a business. There are people who are earning money on administrating these standards which are used for certification schemes. So, but let's look a little on some of them. If we start with these ones which are focused on environmental and social labeling, then they cover a wide range of issues. Fair trade is especially something I see on coffee. Bra Miljöval, it's a Swedish certification scheme for different kind of products in, I can't remember exactly what areas. And the third one, I cannot really see what it is. But they are differentiated in terms of criteria applied and the control system, and they are more or less reliable, because there are some of these schemes where you can actually self-declarate. And while it has a lot of consequences if you self-declarate a CE mark product in Europe and say this is safe and it is not, then when you find out that, or the consumers are injured by using the product, then you are liable. It's not the same with this. If you self-declarate that this is a good environmental choice to choose this product, and it's actually not living up to this, I doubt that you will be brought to court and be liable for that. So there are good or reliable environmental mark schemes and others which are not. When you look at these different types, then it's then ISO, they have categorized the different kind of schemes. The first one, type 1, it's voluntary. They all are more or less. It's multiple criteria based, and it's a third-party program. Multi-criteria based is, for example, if you have the European flour, which is an environmental certification scheme, then you will see that it's not only about the end product, it's a lot about working conditions for the people who have produced the product, how the water from this factory in Bangladesh, how it is administrated. All these things are included in this kind of multi-criteria certification schemes. It's a third-party program, means that it's also, you involve an organization which shall administrate this and carry out an assessment, as you know it from a normal third-party certification. Then you have type 2, which informative environmental self-declaration claims. Here we are on something which is not necessarily reliable. It may be, but it's for sure, you basically get a checklist for your product. And if you can say check, 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 this is fine, then you can self-declare that this product is a good environmental choice. Finally, you have type 3, which is voluntary programs that provide quantified environmental data of a product. I have not even found one. I think they have described this kind of type because if it should be there somewhere, then at least we have a type, a categorization for this kind of scheme. So it's very technical. This is simply where you have facts on the table. We have three, where I come from, three bigger type 1 eco-labeling schemes. We have the EU eco-label, which was established in 1992. It had a very slow start, but now it has become more integrated with regard to criteria with both the Nordic Swan, which is the green one in the bottom, and the German Blue Angel, which is the one in the middle. Here we talk about a lot of products covered by these eco-labeling schemes. So we have different kind of requirements to different kind of products, of course. When a producer of, for example, footwear wants to have eco-label on his product, then he, of course, require the standards and live up to all this. And then the national environmental organization, at Danish standards, we actually administrated these two of the labels, the EU eco-label and the Nordic one. They send out an auditor to check whether this company actually comply with the requirements in the standard. And if they do so, they get an eco-label. In the beginning, it was all these classic products like textile, like detergents. Today, it's hotels, it's camping sites, it's all kind of services are also environmentally labeled. So it's a wide range. Why do the companies want to have such eco-labeling? For some of them, it is promotion. But on the other hand, if all the companies, they have an eco-label, why is it then interesting? Because in the beginning, it was the idea that maximum 20% of the producers should be able to live up to it. Today, it's much more who actually has it. And one reason could be that then they earn more money because they have more customers. Another one is that eco-labels has quite often become a part of public tendering. So when the public wants to buy a service, for example, hotel rooms, big scale, then they have as a requirement that the hotels are environmentally sustainable. And it means that all these things that you can show, if you put your towel on the floor, then it is washed. If you keep it up from the floor, then you can use it one more day. All these things is important for the public purchaser because there is an overall agenda, probably in most countries today, that we shall be environmentally responsible and we shall try to have a sustainable behavior. So therefore, these labels here are important. And then you can ask, but why is it important to us? It is because I don't know how many of our shoes are produced in Vietnam or in other parts of the Southeast Asia. And if shoes are produced in Vietnam, for example, then the third party, this certification organization, they will visit the producer in Vietnam to see whether the work conditions for the employees, whether the handling of water from the production, whether the environment around the factory is living up to the requirements in the standard. So it has a consequence, and therefore it is important that you are aware of this, that suddenly it can be in a contract, and then you should actually live up to a lot of requirements also in Indonesia. I will not go deep into this, but just to give you a little idea about how big the different schemes are. 1,300 licenses have been awarded for eco-labeling, and 17,000 products. Licenses is for each company, and they may have a number of different kind of products. The Blue Angel, 11,700 products distributed on 125 product categories. And finally, the Nordic Swan. These are old figures, and today it has been increased quite a lot. But it gives you a little idea about how many products are certified. How are these? As I said, the process when you develop these standards, these criteria, it's not comparable with what you see in standardization work. For the EU eco-label, it is developed, the standards are developed by working group with stakeholders. Here you have invited stakeholders from industry, some experts, NGOs. It's perhaps the most open one, but still it's not something where you can just sign up. You are invited into the work. For the Blue Angel, it's developed by the Federal Environmental Agency, and it is administered by the German Institute for Quality Assurance and Certification. Here it is a tool which is quite old. It's a tool from the government to ensure that products are made in an environmentally sustainable way. Finally, we have the Nordic Swan, which is the one I know the best. Developed by working groups established by the Nordic eco-labeling organizations, and the members there, it's primarily from the Nordic eco-labeling organizations. For example, this department at Danish Standards, they send their own staff, typically engineers or scientists, to participate in these groups. If they need some specific inputs from the industry, they can invite them. But the decisions are taken by the core members, and these are from the eco-labeling organizations. So it's quite close, this standardization work, if we can call it standardization. The monitoring, it means the maintenance of the eco-labeling includes that the holder, the license holder, is responsible for staying compliant with the criteria. It means that if you produce textile, for example, then you shall take some test samples of the product to ensure that it's still compliant with the requirements. There will be some factory inspections from the eco-labeling organizations where they carry out tests and to find out whether these records they have at the factory are actually correct. And the license holder holds a journal on the test results, and this is one of the, of course, the key documents which will be shared with the eco-labeling organizations when they test or when they carry out audits. I'll just give you a few examples here. Eco-labeling examples for textile, it's about limited use of substances harmful to the environment, limited substance harmful to health, reduced water and air pollution, textile shrink. What has shrink to do with this? It's simply because if you buy something, it's too small after a short period, then you have to throw it out, and it's not sustainable. You shall use it until it is not worth using any longer. And then if you have a product which needs to be certified, then you can find all the the information on this, for example, on this link here, and there are links for all kind of products. For footwear, water pollution during production, reduction of emissions of volatile organic compounds during production, exclusion of substances harmful for environment, and so on and so on. So this is a typical one, and even though these examples here are from Europe, then you also have your own certification schemes in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia, and I think that most of them are based on the same principles as you see here. I'll not go into details about this. It's about what they have for Blue Angel. Textile, it has been harmonized now with the EU eco-label. For footwear, it is a bit special because it has been developed many years ago for the Blue Angel, and in order not to exclude all the holders of Blue Angel certification, they still have something which is quite different from what you see in the EU system. But sometimes they are identical, the requirements, and then you actually get the right both to put on for example, the Nordic Swan and the EU label in one, because it's quite often also administrated by the same organization. Now we come to another one, also a private standard, Global Gap, located in Germany. I was in contact with Vietnamese key account recently, who explained me about how Global Gap works. And Global Gap, they cover a number of different agriculture product areas. They also cover, for example, aqua, water, aquatic, I don't know, something with water, production in water. So, and they cover livestock, they cover normal field production, but they have, I think it's 5 different standards for different kind of areas. There is a very detailed description on how to get a Global Gap certification. Firstly, you shall apply for Global Gap at an accreditation body. Our project is supporting CAN so that they can receive applications for Global Gap certification, but CAN's role is quite limited in the beginning because it's all the documents, all the requirements are produced by Global Gap in Germany. And then the farmer, he shall comply with the standard he has chosen to comply with. He sent an application to a certification body which has been approved to carry out control of farmers with Global Gap. Then there is a certification process as we know it with an audit. There may be some deviations, there may be some a need for one more check of the production, and then they get a Global Gap certificate, and they get on the top of that an annual fee to pay, which is quite high. I mean, it's the same worldwide. So a German, perhaps rich company or farmer, he shall pay exactly the same as a Vietnamese or an Indonesian farmer. So it is not, in my opinion, adapted to the different markets, but this is how it works. And it is one of the problems with global gap is that they focus very much on traceability, meaning that you shall know exactly if a product has a global gap mark, then you should be able to track back to the farmers, almost to the tree where this product has been produced. And it is something which is a challenge if the way you are organized in a sector. For example, let's say the coffee sector is the production of coffee is distributed into, there are so many small, even micro size enterprises producing these products, so that tracing back is quite often a challenge. So therefore, it is possible also to develop a so-called local gap. So there is an Indo-gap, which I do not know if it has been finalized, but it's at least under consideration, perhaps even under development, an Indo-gap which is adapted to the needs in Indonesia, so that more companies or farmers can achieve this, this approval. When I worked in Palestine a couple of years ago, it was the same. They had a PAL gap, Palestine Good Agricultural Practice, which was more realistic for them, because in that country they produce a lot of olives, and it is also typically produced by very small producers, and it's the traceability is a challenge. But the Global Gap Organization has the main objective to have safe and sustainable agriculture worldwide, and it invites all relevant stakeholders to participate in the standard setting process. I don't know exactly, I haven't discussed it with them, but it seems that there is some kind of openness here. But if the openness is limited to companies in Germany, where Global Gap is located, then we can discuss how open it is. But if it's a real open environment, then you have some similarities here to what you know from ISO and IEC. I will not go into details about this here, but it's just the 5 steps to get certified. I hope you will get, if you're interested in this specific thing, I hope you will get this slideshow after we end today, so that you can read the steps yourself. British Retail Consortium, which has a new name, but let's still call it, we can at least call it BRC, is a process-driven product standard. It is still developed for and by the retail organization, the Retail Consortium in England, in UK. It's created, as I said, for retailers, also for distributors, and its main concern is to enhance food safety in international trade business. This is a requirement you may meet if you have international trade in the food sector. That suddenly they say, by the way, we would like the product also to be BRC certified, and this is the reason, again, an example of how a standard in another country actually impact the production methods and the way you shall register and so on in the exporting country, which in this case could be Indonesia. It is very much focused on the needs of the retailers and the distributors. ISO 22000, which is the HACCP standard, is another food standardization system, but it covers all the food chain. It's not the case with BRC. But it doesn't mean that if you have an HACCP, then you automatically have a BRC. They have other requirements. So we can just conclude that this is complicated. Okay, if there are any questions, you're welcome. Otherwise, I would love to have a little break so I could drink a little for my throat. But Mita, do we have any questions? Or shall we just 10 minutes break?
3 questions in chat room, but it's okay if you want to break 5 minutes break. I don't know.
5 minutes, let's say until 3 o'clock. Then I'll be back. It's
Okay.
okay. And
Okay.
take questions. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Mas Pur, Bu Lena, terima kasih.
Okay, it's 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Yeah, I just
So, yeah, this is for questions from Mr. From Mr. Adisam about CB private standard. Adisam, apakah ada? Atau mungkin kita lanjut dulu ke pertanyaan dari Ibu Widayati Sutrisno about SVLK as private standard. Ada Ibu Widayati?
Ada? Halo?
Ya, Bu, silakan.
Terima kasih. Hello, Mr. Carsten.
Hello again.
If I am not mistaken, I have heard you mentioned about SVLK or standar verifikasi legalitas kayu as private standard. Would you please explain once more about that, about the private standard? Thank you.
What is the definition of a private standard? If it's within the definition of a private standard, then it's a private standard. But I'm aware that especially when it comes to legality of wood, which is also the case for the FSC standard, which is very much the same as SVLK, it is used to by governments to ensure that the companies using or exporting timber, that they live up to international agreements on this. So SVLK is in a gray zone. I'm quite sure that the Ministry of Forestry and Environment, that they use it as a kind of enforcement tool to ensure compliance with the legislation. So it is in a gray zone. I mean, I'm also sure that the ministry, they have been deeply involved in the development of the criteria for SVLK. But this is perhaps exactly the problem with the private standards, that sometimes they are really private, and sometimes they are in the gray zone move into the gray zone because the governments or the legislatory institutions find out that this is actually a tool to achieve some overall political goals or objectives. So I don't think you shall, I mean, we both know how FSC and how SVLK works. You know more about SVLK, I'm sure. And it is used by governments to achieve some goals or also live up to international obligations. So, but they are not developed. SVLK criteria, as far as I know, they are not developed by BSN or in some kind of public forum. So they tend to be private, but used as a tool to comply.
Okay, but can we call the SVLK is a sample of private standard?
I know. I said it's a gray zone. I semi private. Yeah.
It's okay.
I think you should more look at how it is used, and perhaps the process when you develop criteria is open, but if it's very much based on international obligations about legality of timber, then it is actually it is perhaps more public than it is private.
Okay, thank you for your explanation.
You're welcome. Do you have more, Mita?
Ya, Pak Adisam, apakah sudah ada?
Yes.
Oke, Pak. Silakan untuk pertanyaannya mengenai CB.
Yes.
Creating private standard.
Thank you, Carsten, for the opportunity to ask question. This is a real condition. If there is some customer need to certify their product, specific product, but there is no regulation or there is no standard, so certification body create some criteria to service their client, and can the certification body create price?
The certification body rarely does. I mean, it's
or not, because there is there is no regulation, or there is no published standard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's of course, if you shall have some kind of certification scheme which is trustworthy, then you need some criteria which have been developed in a way so that they also that you achieve what you want to achieve. So at certification itself, especially if it's a total standalone certification, what is it worth? Who will trust it? So it's a bit tricky. I mean, I'm more familiar with a situation where there is a general need for something in a sector, and then they ask the certification body if they can help them, but the certification body needs an accreditation to do something. So, for example, certification years ago, when we started having not energy crisis, but we started looking a lot on energy consumption, there was a need for some kind of certification of energy consumption. And then the accreditation body developed a set of criteria which should be complied with in order to get a certification. Then the different certification bodies could get this accreditation scheme if they had the necessary competences and all these things. Then it has some kind of it's reliable, it's something trustworthy. And then the companies, they could get this certification from the certification bodies. But a certification is, it shall have a clear scope, it shall have clear criteria or standards behind. Otherwise, it's not worth anything, basically. No matter how nice, how good or accepted or respected the certification body is. Yeah.
Okay. So can we apply to accreditation body also?
Not directly, as the customers of the accreditation body is certification or standard certification bodies, laboratories, inspection bodies. They are the customers of the accreditation body. But what you can do if there is a need for some specific area to have a new accreditation scheme is, of course, to go to the accreditation body and say, perhaps you have a market here. Perhaps you should develop an accreditation scheme so that we can get certified. And then they will consider, because accreditation is, it's a business. If you're the only customer,
Okay.
there's no business.
Thank you.
So, but of course, you can open a dialogue with the accreditation body and find out if they want to develop something, which again shall be a part of the accreditation schemes for the scope for the different certification bodies. So there is a process behind. It's not, you can't just pick down a certification.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mita?
Yes, there are two more questions.
Okay.
From Mr. Claywala from Technical Committee Graphic Technology. Ada Pak Clay?
Yeah.
Yeah, please Pak.
Okay, thank you. Karsten, how are you?
I'm good. I'm awake now. It's 9 o'clock.
It's 10 o'clock. Okay. Yeah, my question is that how many percent should be allocated for the standardization or certifications in producing goods, generally, general market? And do you have data of correlation between the standardization or certification cost versus the profitability of the companies? Thank you.
I think the only, just to take the last question first, the only real research done with regard to correlation between profitability and certification is done on ISO 9000. There have also been done more than one. I could search for it, but I think you can also search yourself. But it's done many years ago. But it was obvious that the companies which implemented ISO 9000, they earned more money than the ones without. Then there are, of course, these things which shall be taken into consideration. If a company has a lot of resources, it goes well, then perhaps it has resources also to develop and implement new systems. So therefore, while the companies which are more under pressure, they perhaps not, they don't have resources to think about new systems and quality management and so on. So there are some question marks you can put to such a investigation or research, but in general, some certifications are simply just obligatory, and certification costs, for example, in Europe, it's very much test reports to show continuous compliance with the requirements used in your standard requirements used in your production. So it's there is something, but not something I think is so important today. With regard to the first question, how many percentage should be allocated? I'll say that the typical profile of participants in standardization are quite big companies. They have the resources, they have departments which naturally can go into such work and try to pick up the latest developments and also be in contact with colleagues, even though they may be competitors at the same time. They also have dialogues with colleagues, informal dialogues, which can be brought back to the company. So there are a lot of side benefits in being in standardization, which is important. But did you say 20%? It's a lot. I mean, it's really a lot. It should not be so expensive. Of course, your certification it differs from sector to sector what is needed, and I cannot put figures on it. But of course, as a person from the standardization world, I think you can benefit a lot. But I don't think only about influence. I think about network, meeting the best consultants, meeting the people from academics, all these things are, it's difficult to put a price on it, but it's worth a lot to have this network if you are in a company.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't reply exactly, Clay, to your question, but it's really difficult. Your question it's a very specific and difficult question. The only thing I can say about research, it's for ISO 9000.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay. Was it the last one, Mita?
Yeah, the last question is from Mr. Susanto. It's about medical device product safety requirement. Ada Pak Susanto?
It's a good one because this this.
Pak Susanto, apakah ada? Do you want to respond this question now, or?
Yeah, if he's here, I'm ready. Or you can do your.
Okay, I'll just read it. The question. It's about medical device product safety requirements. Basically, use IEC 60601 Part 1, which consists of collateral and special standard. For product registration, if those standards are used, or to fulfill it's our law number 20 about standardization and conformity assessment. Are those standards must be mandatory or just voluntary?
Okay, now it's an international standard, but it's probably also at the same time a harmonized standard in Europe. It's not a mandatory standard. It's a voluntary standard. All standards published by ISO are voluntary. Full stop. This is not. It's the single countries which decide sometimes to make a standard mandatory. We will come back to that very soon. It's the next presentation and the final presentations for today. But it's for sure a voluntary standard. But it is without knowing exactly the content of this. If it's a product-related standard, then it's a great help to the producers of this specific product how to comply with of course with the requirements in the standard, but probably also with the legislation in Europe. Because if it is a harmonized standard under the Medical Devices Directive in Europe, then when you use this standard, then you have presumption of conformity with the essential requirements in the legislation, in the directive. So therefore, and I'll come back to this Annex ZA, and it is not called ZA in an IEC standard, because this is an IEC standard. It's an electrotechnical standard you're talking about when it's a 60,000 something. Then the annex is ZZ. It's a very last annex in the European standard, at least, where you have the list of the requirements which shall be fulfilled to comply with the legislation. I could give much more man-to-man advice on this if we met one day. But starting point, first question, is it a mandatory standard? No, it's not. But it's highly recommended if you want to export to Europe that you use the European one, look into the Annex ZZ, and ensure that you comply with all these safety-related requirements. There may be more requirements in the standards, which are luxury requirements. But to get the CE mark on a medical device, which is mandatory, this is mandatory. You have to comply with the requirements in the ZZ annex. Yeah. Okay, I think this is all, but he is welcome to write to me, Mita. I hope you will share my email address, and then I will gladly reply to more specific questions, but it requires a bit research to find out what we're talking about. But otherwise, I will allow myself to continue so that we can end on time, perhaps a little earlier, perhaps also. Okay, Mita?
Okay, Carsten, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Carsten.
Yeah?
It's actually there are two people, two participants that are raising their hands now. Maybe you can answer that question in the next session, or what do you think?
Yeah, I can also do it now, but let me see if I can do it a bit short. Let me hear these two questions from.
It's from Pak Tengku first, I think.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Carsten, me again. This is about private standard. How does private standard interfere with ISO standard? Because to me, private standard kind of a competitor to ISO standard, because the motto of ISO standard is one standard, one certificate accepted everywhere. And now there are some private standard interfere with this motto. Like for agriculture product, to be harmonized, we use ISO 22000 for food safety management system. Plus, I forgot the 22002 parts 5. Yeah. Now, private standard develop again good agricultural practices. How do you think about this?
They're totally overlapping. They're totally overlapping. It's this is why it's in some cases I can really see the benefits. SVLK, FSC for sure. I mean, we don't want the jungle or this to be burned down and not replanted. Makes good sense. It's totally in line with international agreements on timber and so on. This is fine, but for sure other areas where we say, what is the extra value of this? What is the added value besides they earn some money? I totally agree that that this is a good question. I mean, and they are absolutely not coherent with the ISO system. No, it's like you have a big puzzle of ISO standards. The puzzle is done, and then you put a big piece of puzzle on the top of everything. They touch a little on this and a little on that and a little on this, and it has its own life. I believe to a certain degree, of course, I like things to be environmentally correct and done correctly and fair trade and all these things. It's not, but sometimes it's also they just produce extra costs without any kind of value. So, so no, they are not. The other thing you said about this one standard, one certificate, I like one standard. I don't necessarily like one certificate, but this is because I'm from where I am, where we don't try to avoid having too many certificates. But your main question is, do they overlap? Yes, and they are. It doesn't fit in. It's a totally separate world, but you can face it when you want to contract companies in, for example, in Europe, where it's very common to have it in the contract, and suddenly things become much more complicated. So yeah, they overlap.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Next one is Pak Nurman, maybe Pak Nurman.
Yeah, Carsten, just our experience during the pandemic, we come to a new normal life, right? New normal. So any initiating on this standard for the pandemic, something like that? Any country initiative in Europe for how the country or the organization respond on the pandemic, on initiative standard on this? Thank you.
I don't. I mean, just look at the development time for a standard. I mean, the pandemic is over before we have a standard. So I don't think we have done anything with regard to the pandemic. There are probably a lot of thinking afterwards where we say, what should we do with regard to preparedness for such a situation? But for the time being, there's nothing. What I know is that in Europe and perhaps also internationally, they have made the standards for personal protection equipment, ventilators, masks, and so on. You can get them for free, so that the standardization organizations in that way contribute a bit to the solution, but it's on that level. It was standards which existed already. We should just be sure in Europe, at least, that the masks were CE marked and in accordance with the Medical Devices Directive. So no, I don't think there have been developed some things in the standardization world. Not what I know of. I'm sure they would have promoted it a lot if they had done so, but simply the time. I mean, it takes time to develop such a thing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I think you can continue, Karsten.
We continue.
Yeah.
We are out of good standardization practice, but let me see. We are out of talking good standardization practice. We are a bit on the edge of the topic, but still I've got earlier today a question which is closely related to what we are going to discuss, or I'm going to present now, namely the use of standards for regulation. As I said earlier, the WGPT Agreement advise or recommend to use international standards for technical regulations because it facilitates international trade. Then we have sometimes this kind of, in my opinion, misunderstanding that we shall make the international standards mandatory and make them to be technical regulation. You cannot be blamed if you do so that you make technical barriers to trade, because you actually do exactly as it can easily be understood, at least, and it is written in the WGPT Agreement. But there are some complications in this, and this is what I'm going to focus on now. Firstly, and I don't think this is very necessary for an audience like we have today, it's important to remember the difference between standards and technical regulation. Standards are developed by a recognized body, a standardization body that provides, and it's provided for common and repeated use. It includes rules and guidelines and characteristics for products and services, and its compliance is not mandatory. When a standard is made mandatory, it's not a standard any longer, then it's a technical regulation. A technical regulation at the same time lays down product or service characteristics or their related processes and production methods, including the administrative provisions with, and the compliance is mandatory. This is the basic difference. I think we are all aware of that. When you develop new technical regulations, there are some building blocks. Firstly, you have the policy part. The policy part is developed by the political system. We want clean air in Jakarta, could be the policy, or we want clean water in the rural districts where it may be a problem or whatever. Let's talk about, it could be clean air in Jakarta. If you have such a policy goal, then you shall find out how can we solve this problem. You carry out, it's part of good regulatory practice to carry out an impact assessment. What will be the costs if we want to have clean air? Who produces the unclean air in Jakarta? Then you make an impact assessment and find out what can we do. Sometimes you say, perhaps people, they can self-regulate. It is possible in certain situations. You can make awareness of this, inform them that it is important to use this car, to buy this kind of cars or this kind of motorbikes. You can educate them through the television or whatever. It's not always enough. And then the next step is to carry out or to implement legislation. And there may be standards which can be used to support such an overall policy goal. And this is what I will try to show you here now. If you look here in the left down corner, you have the technical requirements in the legislation. If we want to solve a problem, it will not be all about the polluted air in Jakarta, but just a part of it. Then you could perhaps find a standard which somehow address this problem. And you can do it in different ways. The first one is that you take a part of the standard and put it directly into your legislation. This is not recommended. Therefore, it has given it stripes. You can also reference a standard. It can be done in different ways. I'll show you soon how it can be done. Or you can deem to satisfy standards. This deem to satisfy standards is the way we actually use standards very much in European legislation. So the technical regulations or the requirements in the technical regulations can be used this way if you want to use standards in the legislation. Then there's be some kind of proof that you actually comply with the requirements. It can be the first party supplier, they make a self-declaration. Now we live up to this requirement in the standards. I know a lot of people, when they look at CE marking in Europe and hear that it's just the manufacturer himself who make a self-declaration. It's true that this is how it's done, but you should remember that the manufacturer will always be liable for his products. So in case he make a self-declaration which is false, which is not true, then afterwards a consumer or a user is injured, then they will go back and look in his files and say, how can you say this is safe and can have a CE mark, and now people are injured? Then they will find out that it was actually not in good faith that he signed this self-declaration. So even though there is a self-declaration, it has a certain value, because the consequences, if you lie, if you write something which is not true, can be quite harsh to the manufacturer. The second kind of conformity assessment is a purchaser. Your customer confirms that this product is okay. It's another kind of declaration. Or the third one, which is the one we all probably trust a bit more, it is when we have a third party who check whether there is compliance with the requirements in the standard. It can be a regulatory authority, a designated entity. A designated entity is, for example, if you have a department in a specific ministry which go out and control a specific kind of production. Or it can be multilateral recognition agreements. What do the regulatory authority do? They can issue pre-market approvals where it is required. This is something we have left in Europe a lot. We have few ones still, but basically we have left this pre-market approval in Europe. You still see it in many countries, probably also in Indonesia. I know at least a lot in the Southeast Asian region, you have pre-approvals. Before you can place a product on the market, you need an approval. In Europe, we have, in order not to delay the placement of new products on the market, then we have allowed the manufacturers to do these self-declarations and basically take more responsibility for the products when they have placed them on the market. So therefore, we don't use pre-market approvals any longer. There are, for some products which are really dangerous, let's say it's a pacemaker for your heart, then there is a long procedure before you can put fix a CE mark on a pacemaker. So it's close to be a pre-market approval, but it's still basically, the idea is that it's still the manufacturer who has a full responsibility for his product, also when it's a dangerous one like a pacemaker. Then you have market surveillance carried out after the products have been placed on the market, and you can apply the different sanctions. The sanctions, they can be administrative. You can be asked to recall your product from the market if we find out that this is not safe. This is where we have in RAFs in Indonesia for food and feed, and we will have in the future in RAPEX, which is a similar system where we register very dangerous products placed on the market, and the natural consequence for the distributor or the manufacturer is that they are asked to recall the product from the market. You can also be asked to repair, destroy, or re-export, simply send it back out of the country again. Or you can be brought to the court of law. This is a situation where things are kind of criminal. Then you can be brought to the court and perhaps get a sentence there. So this is how you can use standards. But how do you refer to standards in technical regulations? This is really a key issue. The advantage in utilizing standards in technical regulations is that, first of all, the legislator can rely on recognized solutions described in the standard. The alternative may be that civil servants in a ministry, perhaps supported with some advisors, they sit and develop something which they believe will be the right solution. If they take a standard, then they know that it has been developed by a lot of experts, it has been in public inquiry, and it has been approved by the interested parties at the end of the day. So then you have a recognized solution. This is, of course, a clear advantage in using standards. So it automatically also facilitates a high degree of acceptance among the companies because they are familiar with these standards, hopefully, and they also know that they have been developed in an environment of consensus and openness and transparency and so on, which we know from standardization. It's cost effective. It can cost a lot of money, a lot of resources to develop requirements yourself. This is now you can just buy a standard and you can use it as you want in your legislation, much more cost effective. And standards, they remain up to date. Every 5 years at the latest, they're revised, and then you can take the newest version and say, now this is the recognized solution in this field. So there is a lot of smartness in using standards in technical regulation. But there are things to consider when you use standards in technical regulation, because the scope of a standard is not necessarily exactly what should be addressed in the technical regulation. You may have some problems with a specific kind of products on the market, but the standard may have a slightly different scope, or it has another focus. So even though it's for this kind of product, then it may not really address the problem you have. Furthermore, the standard is written in a style which not necessarily support a mandatory solution, a mandatory implementation. Standards, they have a certain, I will not sit and say exactly how standards shall be drafted, but there are some rules about how to formulate. And sometimes you are not very clear. You actually give some kind of different options, and this is not necessarily good in a legislative text. So therefore, standards are not necessarily drafted in a way which is can be used for technical regulation. The requirements, are they clear in the technical regulation in the standards? It's also a question which shall be raised, because if they are not clear, then you have legal uncertainty, which is absolutely something you shall avoid as a civil servant. And is the standard available? It's if you refer to a standard and then you have to go to BSN and buy it and so on, it becomes a bit complicated, and it should be available. So how do you use standards in regulation? If you have a standard, you can incorporate it in the text. It's not recommendable at all. But you can also reference in the text to a standard, and you can do it in two different ways. You can do it directly, a direct exclusive reference, or you can do it indirect and indicative reference. Let me give you examples. I think we have. When you look at direct exclusive referencing, then the standard becomes a part of the technical regulation. It means that in the text you say, to comply with this, you shall use this standard. It means that the standard actually, even though it's just a reference, it becomes a part of the mandatory text in the technical regulation. There are no alternative options to demonstrate compliance with the technical regulation. You shall do it as it is described in the standard. It means that if you shall do a test, then, and the test is described, the test method is described in the standard, then you have to do it this way. You cannot, even though there are alternative ways of proving it, you cannot do it. You have to do it this way. When we are talking about direct exclusive reference, then it is a dated standard. It means that there is a number, a title, a date, and a scope. And especially the date is crucial here. By making a reference to, for example, this ISO standard 12945 from 2001, it was part 1 from 2001, then you know that as long as you don't change this here, then people will always go back and find exactly this standard from 2001. As we know, standards are reviewed and sometimes they are revised, so it may change version, so that there is now a version 2006 and 2012 and 2015 and 2020, but you still stick to this one from 2001. This could be a problem. It will quite often be a problem, because the companies which actually work in this business here, they typically use, at least if they have comply with the technical regulation in Indonesia, we did 20 years ago when this standard was in force. So, but there are examples. The information security system shall conform with ISO IEC 27001 from 2013 about information technology, security techniques, information. This is a way to freeze the word. The alternative to this one is that you don't use the date. It means that when you make a reference, you can still make a reference to this ISO standard we just talked about, 1, 2, 4, something we had, but without 2001. It means every time it has been revised, it will be the newest version. So it's when it's 2006 and the new version is published, it's 2006. 2011, new version, 2011 version is valid. It's the one you use. And 2020, it's a total different standard from what you had in 2001 when you started using this reference. What is the problem if you do so? It is, of course, that technical regulation is a responsibility of the public authorities. And by doing it this way, you actually allow the standardization bodies to describe or to write technical regulation. It means that if the requirements have become much more stringent, much more strict in these last 15, 20 years, then the legislation has also been changed. It also means that, especially if you refer to international standards, then it's not necessarily Indonesian interests which are reflected in the standard. It's all the other players in the standardization world. So the regulators, you can say indirectly, the regulators are not even in Indonesia. They are sitting in some standardization committee somewhere in Rio de Janeiro and writing texts which directly influence the legislation in Indonesia. So that it is flexible, it is smart to a certain degree, but it is also a bit risky as a legislator. We have example again, same here, for management of information technology. I think it's some kind of data security. Here you don't have it, but every time there is a technological development in this field, and there is for sure when it comes to information technology, a rapid development of new technologies, then you are updated in your legislation. But it also means that some of the requirements, which may be more and more demanding, they are automatically incorporated in your legislation. Then we have the last one, and I will stop after this here. It is the indirect indicative referencing. It is what we could call the EU approach, which was invented back in the mid-80s and called the new approach. In the new approach, we have legislation which covers a lot of products. Earlier, we had legislation for cucumbers. Cucumbers, when you pack them into a box, then they should be straight, because if they are rounded or bended, then they fill up too much and you cannot have so many cucumbers in your boxes as you. So there were ridiculous standardized legislation on European level at that time. Then they said, now we stop this, and then we make, not for food products, but for other kind of products, we make framework legislation. Legislation for machines, legislation for electrical equipment, for pressure equipment, for personal protection equipment, but areas where you have personal protection, it's helmets, it's shoes, it's gloves, it's firemen's clothes, it's all kind of different things. And then we said, for these things, we shall ensure that people are protected against whatever. Fire, to be have something on the head. This was the overall essential requirement. And then we made harmonized standards for each product, for helmets, for shoes, for firemen clothes. We make standards which describe in detail what shall be achieved to ensure that people working on a construction site with a helmet, that they are protected. So this is a way to use standards where we don't change the legislation. The legislation is the same always, but the standards they are all the time renewed and modernized, but still there are these annexes to the harmonized standards which say these requirements are the ones you shall comply with in order to live up to have presumption of conformity with the essential requirements. So this is the indirect indicative referencing, the EU approach, which works with us, but it will be a revolution in the legislative framework if you implement it in other countries. You have already actually in the ASEAN region what we call ASEAN harmonized regulatory regime for electrical and electronic equipment, I hear, or something like that. And I don't know if it was correct what I said here, but this is actually based on the EU approach, because you have merged two of our new our directives, one for electrical and electromagnetic compatibility, and the one for low voltage products. It has been merged into this here regulatory regime, and by using the standards harmonized in Europe under these two directives, you actually comply per default with your own legislation. But this is the only place where we have really copied the European system. But this is what we have. So this is the third way of referencing standards. So in this case, you have the technical regulation only contain essential requirements, these basic requirements to the different kinds of products. Relevant standards are listed in an official publication. This is a list of harmonized standards under each directive. The standards are voluntary. If you want to find another way to comply with the essential requirements, you can do so. You are not obliged to use the standards. But of course, if you don't use the standards and people are hurt by your products and you are brought to the court, then they will ask you, why didn't you use the standards? So you have a better case in case you use the standards as a proof of compliance with the essential requirements. It's easier to maintain copyright of adopted ISO IEC standards. Compliance with listed standards is recognized as compliance with the essential requirements, as I've said, but still other technical solutions may be acceptable. When new technical regulation is implemented in Europe, we don't necessarily have standards from the very beginning. So therefore, the companies, they have to find a way to comply without standards. But then you have a demand, I can tell you, because then they say, this is really difficult. We have to have some help. Please make some standards which can help us. Now we have many standards in Europe. So the demand is going down. But in the beginning, in the 90s, the demand for new standards, these so-called harmonized standards, was very high. I will stop here because I promised to stop at 4 o'clock. We can have but firstly, I think you will get the full presentation. I'm sure Mita will send it out, or we will send it out from our office. I don't know. But there were a few more slides here I could have shown, but I decided not to, because I think it is covered more or less. But what I would like to remind you now is that there is an evaluation. And also, if you have questions, you're welcome. But perhaps Mita or Citi or Maulina or whoever we have, they will explain about the evaluation. And then at the same time, if you have any questions, you're welcome now. Mita?
Carson, the evaluation link is already shared in the chat box. So Bapak Ibu mohon partisipasinya untuk mengisi evaluation feedback ini supaya di kegiatan berikutnya kami bisa lebih baik lagi. What I see is there's one question from Pak Muhammad Farid. Maybe Pak Muhammad Farid bisa melakukan, bisa menanyakan langsung kepada Pak Karsten. Silakan Pak.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. I'm the member. Sorry. I am the member of Technical Committee 13.3 of Environmental Quality. We adopt a standard from ISO, but ISO issue a new standard where the procedure is changed, but the technical committee assumes that the old procedure is still okay for Indonesia. It's allowed or forbidden for this reason?
It's fully allowed. It's fully allowed to. This is the right of a national standards body to issue standards, and even if a standard is withdrawn, or as in your case is revised, you can still use the old standard, have it as a national standard. Now this is perhaps a more domestically used standard you are working with, but if it was something international, it could create some problems if you don't update, let's say, for a product. But still, standards are voluntary. So if it was a product, the companies could still decide to use the newest version, and then they just ignore that there is an old adoption in this shopping basket of BSN. So you are fully allowed to do this if it meets your need for the time being. You can leave it. I mean, it may be a good idea when you sell it, when people go to BSN to buy it, that they are informed that you shall know that there is a newer version in case they want to use it for some international corporation or whatever. But if it's for domestic use, it's not a problem. They are not obliged to update. What I think you should have, I mean, what you could expect from the Secretariat, and now I don't want to blame anybody, but they should know that there is a new version on its way, because it doesn't happen overnight. So you should know, be informed by the Secretariat that now they have started a revision and it has reached this stage code. You know, the development of standard, they have all these stage codes, 90.60 and so on. And whenever they start the process of revising, it has a stage code. And then I think that you should have been informed so that you are not surprised by a newer version at a late stage. But I don't know, perhaps you have been informed and you have just decided to continue. But this is one of the obligations, in my opinion, of a secretariat. It is to follow the development of new standard, of revised versions of a standard which is still valid when you started, but now it has been replaced. So, yeah.
This is the problem is the technology, Mr. Carlson, because the technology, because maybe in Europe use the new technology, but Indonesia didn't have this technology, still use the old one technology.
Yeah,
like this is the problem.
Yeah. I mean, this is when sometimes they decide to modify standards, but then they you could also take the new version and modify it, but then you lose the number because you have this number of is it 14,000 and something, or what is it? No, it's not a system. It's
about testing technology. But testing technology.
Okay, it's a technical one. Yeah.
Because I think Europe and America is more advanced than Indonesia. Still, Indonesia use the classical, but I see the Indian country still use the old one for internal.
Yeah. Internal this use. Is you may even be in a. I mean. when you think about who is developing this standard, it may also be the companies developing the equipment, the test equipment, and they want to sell the newest test equipment. So it is. Standardization is not a public institution. It's hardcore business. So you may also be a victim of hardcore business. They simply just want to push for the best, the newest technology all the time. But it's still, remember, as long as you don't make it mandatory, as long as it is a voluntary standard, I don't think it's a big problem. If it's but for sure, the committee can recommend, because of this and this, namely that the equipment is not available yet in Indonesia, you can recommend that you keep the old standard for at least a period of 5 years, and then you review and find out whether you shall update to the newest version.
Thank you, Carsten.
Good and relevant question. Yeah.
Okay, Carsten, there are 2 participants raising their hands. Are you willing to take their question?
Yeah.
Okay, Pak Susanto, mohon Pak Susanto.
Thank you, Carsten. Until now, BSN has released more than 200 standards for hospital, for medical devices. Second, the regulation for submit product registration in Indonesia is used ASEAN Medical Device Directive. It is adopted fully from European country. If from your information before, if we use standard from European country, that this must be harmonized. It means the product standard must be mandatory, like this, yeah.
Not mandatory.
But must be mandatory, and that is still use MDD 93/22. I'm forget. But you know that in Europe now have been removed to medical device regulation, the new one, this. Yeah,
it's a tendency,
I have experience in this. Although all more than 200 standard product of medical device, not one have been mandatory. My company have been make our product comply, with the standard. We have SNE. By that, we must create our laboratory like this. And the question is, more than 200 standard like this, in your opinion, if use regulation from European, if must be comply with the standard, it must be mandatory. But the problem, the certification body, also the laboratory, is the constraint in Indonesia. I think the basic criteria of medical device is safe and effective as intended use. That is the problem. Safe and effective as intended use must be mandatory of the standard. Your opinion for make a guarantee, our product can go internationally or locally in safe product. What is your opinion? Thank you.
Firstly, I mean, now you said it a couple of times that the standard is mandatory. It's not mandatory. What is mandatory is the medical device directive, which is now correctly has been changed to a medical device regulation. And the reason why they have changed it has not changed content a lot, but it has changed the way it is implemented in the different countries, because a directive you can twist a few things in a directive when you implement it in the countries, but therefore to be sure that it's 100% identical in all countries, they do it as a regulation. It's a legal technical issue, so it has not changed much. when it comes to the standards, they are voluntary, but they are harmonized, these ones you are talking about. And if you want to see the latest version, then you should go into the medical device regulation harmonized standards, just search for that. Then there'll be a long list with all the newest versions. You should be sure that you have the newest version, especially in this field. I mean, I have worked in, and therefore I'm so glad when I get questions about medical devices, because I worked in a notified body for medical devices many years ago, but the system is still the same. But they're very rigid. I mean, they're very, they really, they try to keep a really high standard in this sector. So if you want to export to Europe, you have to ensure that the products are covered by harmonized standards. If they are not,
that's right.
only have the legislation. And the legislation, and then you shall actually carry out a risk assessment and all these things yourself, which is no fun when you don't have a standard.
Very complicated. Very complicated.
It's very complicated because they are so rigid. But the standard is still a help. You are not obliged to use it. It is voluntary. With regard to involvement of notified bodies and so on, it depends on how dangerous it is. If it's a cotton bud, it's no problem. If it's something bandage or something simple, you don't need notified bodies. It's only for the complicated ones. I'm sure you know a lot about this. But I only want to correct you on one thing. It's not mandatory standards. They are harmonized and they great help, but you are not obliged to use them.
Thank you, Carsten. Thank you.
Did we have one more? And then we shall end because we are over time now.
Yeah, I think there's one more from Pak Nurman.
Carsten, again, the opinion on the mandatory and voluntary, as well as beyond and compliant. So I think the global community has to be more aware on that standards should be voluntary, right? But my experience in Indonesia working with some industry or under CFCD, Corporate Forum for CSR Development, we have a problem that some term that they are prefer or like the mandatory matters compared to a voluntary. How we can change this wrong perception among them? Because if a mandatory standard they would like to adopt, but when the voluntary they're half-hard to adopt. That's the problem. And the second question is the procedure. How call it? Self-declaration of self-adoption, as you mentioned before.
Sorry, the last question, what did you say? Sorry.
Yeah, the self-adoption or the self-declaration on voluntary standard. Do you have some simple procedure?
Yeah,
so
I have a simple
my
question
member
for you.
in CFCD can easily adopt for some, for the good progress of standard development as I join in this BSN as a partner. Thank you, Carsten.
Yeah, I mean, the first question or comment or whatever we shall take it as, with regard to the use of standards or making them mandatory in many countries, I think it's sometimes it's a consequence of they have a problem. There is a standard which solves the problem. They don't have these framework legislation we have in Europe and the same kind of legislative system. And then this is the best out of a lot of poor solutions. This is the best possible solution they have. So it requires a lot of training, a lot of education, and also not only criticizing, but also finding ways forward when you have a problem, ways where you don't use standards or make them mandatory. So when we are sitting here today, even though I consider Indonesia to be quite advanced, even though your colleague said that they don't have so much equipment to test, I think it's not so bad. But when we are sitting here today and discuss this, this is a way to disseminate knowledge about this, that if you just think about it next time, that it's not necessarily the mandatory standard which is the solution. Let's try to find another way, or make a reference to the standard in a way so that we don't make it difficult for ourselves later on, or make technical barriers to trade in the long run when the standard becomes old, and so on and so on. So I can only see it as a training and dissemination of information. This is one thing. The other question was, what was it? It was, now I can't remember your second question. Sorry, I can't remember the second question, Norman.
Mungkin bisa diulang, Pak Nurman? Pertanyaan keduanya.
Just a keyword, then I know what you mean, because
the second question. Yeah, I think also did you answer. That's okay.
I did. Okay, super. Thank you. You saved me. Good. Okay. Was it all, Maulina? If it's Maulina.
I think I saw one in the chat room. If you want to answer, it's from Pak Edi Wiloso. Kalau Pak Edi ada, boleh silakan ditanyakan langsung, Pak.
Yes, last one. Can we say this is the last one?
Yes, last one.
This is the last one, not the least. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I think this is about similar nature question regarding the indirect referencing, because it says that the standard is highly recommended, but it remains voluntary. So it's not quite the strong statement, that kind of options. So in this case, I think companies will likely to choose not to use the standard at all. Perhaps they think it is easier and cheaper option for them. What do you think? Thanks.
I agree that you know, it is in the nature of human beings that if you can find an easier way or cheaper way to get around it, you choose it. I think it should be understood when we read this recommendation, or this strong recommendation still from the WTO, or in the WTO WGPT Agreement, that we shall use international standards in order to avoid establishment of technical barriers to trade. Then it is mostly to avoid pure national standards, because pure national standards, which only look at the national needs and perhaps is dominated by companies which have a very specific interest, this is not good for international trade. And WTO is a trade organization. It's not a social welfare organization. They look at smooth trade. So this is a pure focus for WTO when they come with this recommendation. When you say it is, they try to get around when it's only a voluntary standard, then the legislation, the technical legislation, this is the level which you should comply with, and they can't, I mean, they can't go under that limit or under these this threshold or these requirements. So the quality of the technical legislation is perhaps the main problem in many countries, and therefore they tend to just make standards mandatory, because then you are both in compliance with WTO, and at the same time you don't have to think about how to regulate really difficult areas like mobile phone technology or things like that. It's an easy solution, but I think it's quite often because of the whole legislative framework is not so good, and then they just use standards as mandatory standards. But of course, if you don't make them mandatory and you have poor in some countries, poor technical regulation, then it is possible to get around it and put something on the market which is legal, but of a very poor quality or perhaps even unsafe. So I can follow you. I can see your problem, Eddie, but I think it's much more. It's a big problem. I think the technical regulation in many countries it's a bit poor. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to end for now. We are over time. I promised to end at 10 o'clock, 4 o'clock. Now it's 4:15. So I think I will just say thank you very much for for your attendance, for your good questions. It has been a pleasure to me. Next week I have another 2-day webinar. It'll be about good regulatory practice. Hope to see some of you again. I'm always ready to discuss a bit standards also if it's relevant in the context, but otherwise it's a new topic, but also interesting. And it addressed very much the problem, Eddie, you addressed, namely that legislation shall be developed in coordination with other existing legislation and so on, and there shall be a discussion about it and so on. So, but it's next week. Now I'll just give the floor to Mita, and then she can close down and say thank you for today. Thanks.
Terima kasih, Karsten. Thank you very much for your presentation. Baik, Bapak Ibu, kita sudah selesai untuk acara workshop Good Standardization Practice selama 2 hari ini. Terima kasih atas partisipasi aktif Bapak dan Ibu, baik yang di ruang Zoom maupun di YouTube. Jangan lupa untuk mengisi daftar hadir dan link evaluasi yang ada di chatroom. Lalu untuk sertifikat nanti akan dikirimkan ya Mbak Siti melalui email yang sudah Bapak Ibu isikan. Seperti itu. Apakah ada tambahan dari tim ARISE Plus?
Cukup Mbak Mita, terima kasih.
Iya, baik. Terima kasih Bapak dan Ibu. Mohon maaf atas segala kekurangan dalam acara ini. Mungkin sebagian kita akan ketemu lagi di workshop Good Regulatory Practice minggu depan. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam Bu Mita.
Bye.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karsten.
You're welcome. Hope to see you again.
Thank you, Mas Karsten.
Thank you, Karsten.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Karsten. Okay.
Saya izin live ya Mita.
Ya Pak, terima kasih
Kita
Pak.
salib ya Mbak.
Makasih Bu.
Ya sama-sama.